Hey guys, today I'm going to go over some tricky questions in arrays 2, or at least questions that are have little tricks to them that I want you to know. Today we're going to go over count evens, centered average, sum 67. So count evens, centered average, sum 67, shift left, 10 run, and Fizzbuzz. Let's get to it. Count evens. This one's not a particularly difficult one, but you're just counting the number of even numbers in an integer array. Like every other, like we did in strings, you can create a little int variable to hold how many even numbers you've seen. You got to use mod to check that it's an even number. But the reason I wanted to do this one is because it's a great example of a question you can use this enhanced for loop or a for each loop in. So for every integer element, which we're calling num in the array nums, if that element mod 2 equals 0, we increase our count. So instead of having a for loop where your variable is the index, num is the actual element in the array. So it's for questions like this, there are 3 criteria if you want to use a for each loop. You want to make sure that you don't want to change the array. To do that, you need to use your standard for loop and mess with the index. You don't want to compare any of the elements to any of their neighbors. Like if you've got to say every element is smaller than its neighbor to the right, that won't work with this because you have no idea what's to the left or right because you don't have the index. And also, if you don't want to record the index. Again, if you don't want to compare it to any of its neighbors, if you don't want to change the array itself, and you don't need to return an index or anything like that, an enhanced for loop is a great idea. This is the count evens. That's about it for each loop. If the element you're looking at is an even number, we increase our count, and then we just return our count at the end. All right, next guy. We'll do centered average. This guy is a bit more complicated, but there's a relatively simple way to do it. And this is, I think, about the easiest way you can do it. Also, another example of something you use a for each loop with. So you want to return basically you're returning the average of the numbers in the array, except you're ignoring the biggest number and the smallest number. Now, you'd think this would be kind of complicated, but our strategy will just be, we're going to go through the whole array. We're going to keep track of the smallest number we see. We're going to keep track of the biggest number we see, and we're going to keep track of the sum of all numbers, including the biggest and the smallest. And then at the end, if we want to find the centered average, so we're ignoring the smallest number and the biggest number, we take the sum of all numbers, subtract the smallest one, subtract the biggest one, and then divide by the length of the array minus 2. Minus 2 because we haven't included the smallest and the biggest number. We subtracted them off. So here we go. Anytime you're trying to find the smallest and the biggest, you either want to make your initial minimum one of the numbers in the array, which is usually the easiest. I usually make it the first thing. Or you want to make it the biggest possible number, so the max integer value. And you want to make your max your minimum integer value, because as soon as you hit the first number, it'll either be that number, or in the max case, it'll be bigger, and in the min case, it'll be smaller. I always find it easier just to make it equal to the first thing in the array. And we're starting our sum at 0. I use another enhanced for loop. You can use integer. That's kind of the object version of ints. Int is the primitive version. Integer is the object version. Java has this fancy way of converting between them automatically. This will work just the same. So for every integer element, which we're calling num in the nums array, we're going to make our min value equal to the smaller. Math.min, you give it 2 numbers, it's equal to the smaller of the 2. So if you give it 5 and 7, it would be equal to 5. So in this case, we're giving it our lowest number we've seen so far and the current number. So it'll be equal to the smaller of the two. So either if our old min is the smallest, it's equal to our old min. If our new number is the smallest, it's equal to that. And then same idea with the max. Math.max, you give it two numbers, it's equal to whichever one is bigger. So if you give it 5 and 7, it's equal to 7. And we add the number to our sum. Sum just holds the total of all the numbers added together. So then at the very end, our min holds our smallest number, our max holds our biggest number, and sum holds all the numbers, including the smallest and the biggest added together. To ignore the smallest and the biggest, we take our total, we subtract the biggest number we saw, subtract the smallest number we saw, and divide it by the length of the array, minus 2 because we got rid of the biggest and the smallest. And that's our centered average, one that usually throws people a little. Next guy, we're doing sum 67. Sum 67 is a bit funny. You go through array, you add up all the numbers, but as soon as you see a 6, you ignore that one, you don't add it, you ignore everything coming after it until you hit the next 7, and it includes the next 7. You don't add the 7 either, but then after that you'd start adding normally. So in this case, it's equal to 5 with this array because you add 1 plus 2 plus 2, which is 5, and then you hit this run of 6s that eventually hits a 7. There will always be a 7 in the array. For this guy, it's 4 because it's 1 plus 1. We start 6, hit a 7, so we ignore those two, and then we add the 2. 1 plus 1 plus 2 is 4. So the way I love doing this is standard for loop and using a while loop inside. So every time we want to find the sum, we got to make a variable to hold the sum we've seen so far. So for all the elements in the array, if the number we're looking at is a 6, that means the start of numbers we're going to ignore. While numside is not equal 7, we're going to keep adding 1. Notice as soon as it equals 7, this will exit and then it'll go there. So the current index will be 7, but it'll hit the end bracket and then do I++. So the next pass through the for loop, it will be looking at the thing after the 7. If the number you didn't see wasn't a 6 and you're not going between the 6s and the 7s, you just add the number you're looking at to your sum and then you return your sum. So this is kind of a nice little trick if you're ignoring a run of things. So I wanted to show you this guy. All right, next guy is shift left. So for this guy, you want to make the array but shifted left, so the first element becomes the last element and everything else is moved forward. So the last thing, or the first number goes to the end and then everything else is shifted left by 1. Anyway, so here's how I did it. I created, for something like this where you're shifting, you're probably going to want to make a new array and just add the numbers to it. Otherwise you need like a temporary variable and it gets kind of ugly. Not that it would be impossible in this case, but it would be kind of annoying. All right, so all I'm doing here is if I have a result bigger than 0, I'm going to make the last thing in my return array, the last element of it, equal to the first element of the array they give me. So it's kind of like, you see the 6 here, I'm putting it at the end of the array I return. So the first element goes to the end. And then aside from that, I just say for int I equals 0, I is less than, so basically I go through my result array and fill in all the other numbers except for the last element, which I've already dealt with. That's why it keeps going until it's nums.length minus 1, because I don't want to go straight to the end, I want to go 1 before it because I already dealt with the last element. And basically I make the result at I, which starts at 0, equal to nums I plus 1. So that'll take this 2 here and put it in the first element of my return array. That take this 5, it'll make it the second element. This 3, make it the third element. And then I return the result. So yeah, nice little shifting thing. Notice I did have to use a standard for loop because I gotta deal with where things are in the array. Like what's the first element, what's the last element, stuff like that. All right, next guy, we want to do 10 run. 10 run, I just used a bit of a trick. This guy here, basically you just run through the array and it stays the same, except as soon as it hits the first multiple of 10, you just keep making each element that multiple of 10 until you hit the next multiple of 10, and then you start adding that multiple of 10. So in this case, we add the 2 because we haven't hit a multiple of 10 yet, and then we hit 10, which is our first multiple of 10 we've seen, and so everything after it we make a 10 until we hit another multiple of 10. We hit the 20, and so then after that we make everything a 20. I don't know. Take a look at this until that makes sense. It's not too bad, but I've got like a flag variable here. My numbers are always positive, and so I'm using that to my advantage by starting off my last 10 value as -1. This means I don't need to have another variable because -1 is an impossible value since all these numbers are positive. And so I just go through my whole array, and if the number I'm currently looking at, mod 10, equals 0, I set my last 10 variable to the current value. And then if it's greater than or equal to 0, which deals with my little flag value. So if it's a real number that I got from the array, not my starting value, which is impossible from the real array, I set the current number equal to the last 10 I saw. So that's it. So sort of a flag value, an impossible value that gets set once the condition you're looking for happens, and that stops you from needing like another Boolean variable to be like seeing a 10 or something like that. You could also do it with a Boolean flag, it's called, just to say that you've seen a 10, but setting this value to -1, if that's an impossible value, is another good way to do it. Yeah. Alrighty. Notice since we're changing the array, we cannot use a for each loop. All right, next one, we've got the last guy, Fizzbuzz. This is a very famous programming problem and could show up in an interview potentially, though it's so famous at this point, you're a little less likely to see it in an interview because you may have just memorized it, though it's likely to come up if you take computer science in university. Anyway, so the gist of this is you want to return an array that starting from this starting number and finishing right before this ending number, where the elements are the numbers but in string form, except if something is a multiple of 3, I want to replace the number with fizz. And if something is a multiple of 5, I want to replace it with the word buzz. And if it's a multiple of both, I want to replace it with Fizzbuzz. I don't have the most elegant solution here, but it's pretty easy to follow and it's just as efficient. So I'm just going to use this. Anyway, so you just put the numbers in string form from the start to right before the end. Here we're going from 1 to 5. So we're not including the end number right before the end number. Anyway, so here we go. So we're making a string array for a response, and it's equal to the right length. End minus start will be the correct length. My index starts at 0, and my int I, this is the index of the array I'm adding to. This is to deal with the fact that I'm going to be looping from start to end. The numbers, so if I went from like 10 to 20, I would be from 10 to 19. But my indexes for the array want to go from 0 to 9. So I've just got this extra variable. Anyway, so if the number I'm looking at is a multiple of 3 and a multiple of 5, so I could have just put a multiple of 15. I didn't actually need to do it in 2. I would set the answer at the index to Fizzbuzz. Otherwise, if it's just a multiple of 3 and not 5, because I check for this first, I don't have to check that it's not a multiple of 5. I set my answer at the current index I'm adding to an answer to Fizz. If it's just a multiple of 5, I set the answer at the current index I'm looking at to Buzz, and otherwise I want to set the answer at the current index I'm looking at to, I could have done the string.value of, like they suggested. If I could have done string.value of I, but it works just as well if you do an empty string plus I, because a string plus an int is a string. So that is a shorter way of writing string.value of to convert an int to a string. And then I just return my answer at the end. Notice I'm also getting kind of fancy here. You can have 2 things happen at the end of every for loop. Here I'm incrementing I, which talks about the number I'm currently looking at, and I'm incrementing index, and I'm separating with a comma. I could also, so this works, if you check that out. If I wanted to be less fancy, it would have worked just as well if I just move this to the end after my last else, because I always want to increment index. So notice exactly the same thing. I don't know, just kind of nice putting it in here, but either way you want to do it. Anyway, this is longer than I was hoping. I was hoping to do this in 10 minutes, but apparently that was impossible. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.